Welcome to Chapter 1 of Same Lake, Different Boat, coming alongside people touched by disability. The title of Chapter 1 is On Truth, the Four Missing Words. In this chapter, Steph explores the essential question, why are we surprised by disability?
Growing up, I was really fortunate that in my small town, there were 76 of us in my graduating class, 11 of us from my neighborhood. So if you think about that, they saw me basically from virtually day one to the time I graduated high school as just Jerry. So it wasn't until I moved away from home and started going to college and things that I noticed that people actually reacted different to me. In my relationships with people with disabilities in the disability advocacy world, many of them claim to be believers. Many of them, from what I can see, have a real relationship with Jesus Christ. But for most of us, that means also a relationship with a local congregation or a local church. For many of them, it doesn't. They love Jesus. In fact, Jesus, in their minds, is one of the first historical figures to actually ascribe value to people with disabilities. But they would say the church has messed that up somehow.
We were in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and my husband was on staff at a church, and when my son was born. At one point, we were having trouble getting insurance for him because of they said it was a pre-existing condition, and we were getting him, it was hard to get him covered for things. And I was sitting in church one Sunday and just kind of grieving the pressure of that. And I thought, it is so sad that the world is set up for normal, healthy people. If you're normal and healthy, the system works for you. And if you're not normal or healthy, it doesn't work for you. And as I was thinking that, I looked around my church at all the normal, healthy people sitting around me. And it hit me that the church is set up for normal, healthy people.
I'd like you to think about Angela's comment. Right? It's so sad that the world is set up for normal, healthy people. Then it hit me, the church is set up for normal, healthy people. You know, one of the observations I've made over the years is that those who self-identify as normal and healthy are surprised by disability when they encounter it in life. How do I know that? Because that was my reaction when my son Tim was born back in 1992. My husband Fred and I have two sons. Fred, who's our oldest son, who's now a college student out at Wheaton College, and our younger son, Tim, who's a senior in high school here at Ephrata High School. And our younger son, Tim, was born with Down syndrome. And as the day went by when Tim was born, everything was just kind of weird. When Tim was born, he just looked a lot different than I remembered Freddie looking. And I even noticed that his eyes seemed a little bit slanted, but nobody actually said anything to me. I looked around the room, and everybody was just doing what they would normally do, so I didn't really think much more of it. I kind of dismissed my thoughts, and I never even said anything to Fred. And throughout the day, I had a bunch of different physicians that came in to visit us, and some of the nurses made unusual comments to me like, it's okay to hold them. And I remember thinking, what's she talking about? I already had a baby before. I just was up all night. I just wanted to sleep, and the whole atmosphere was just really kind of strange. And so finally, our family physician came in, and he was just very, very somber and told me he was going to have a pediatrician come in and look at Tim, but that there was probably nothing to worry about. And so I, just kind of went along with the flow for the day. And that evening, the town pediatrician came in, and so an Italian fellow here who's been our pediatrician ever since then, and he said to me in a thick Italian accent, "We believe that Timothy has a chromosomal abnormality." And I remember when he said that, thinking, what are you talking about? And he said, "Have you ever heard of Down syndrome?" And it was just like the whole day came into focus, and just even as the room started to swim out of focus. I just remember the room literally swirling around me as he said that, and I know I was just in a state of shock when I first found out. I had no idea that Tim was going to have Downs. And I was in such a state of shock that when he told me, I remember thinking, I wonder if I should call Fred. And I thought, well, then maybe I'll call him tomorrow. And so I did call Fred. But my mind flooded with adjectives when those words Down syndrome were used. And I have to admit, they weren't positive adjectives. It made me realize that I had all sorts of different prejudices towards people with intellectual disabilities that I didn't even realize that I carried around. And those weren't the things, of course, that I was processing, right at that immediate moment. But when I look back at that, I can really see what was going on in my thinking at that time. So why are we surprised by disability? Why are we shocked when it occurs either in our own lives or in the lives of our family members or in the lives of our friends? Whether we like to admit or not, I think we're really products of our culture. And in order to really develop a biblical perspective on disability, we really have to look at where have we come from in terms of history and in terms of our American culture, and how does that influence how we see this subject. Then we can start to ask, well, if I look at my history and I look at my culture, what can I affirm? What can I not affirm? And then and most important of all, what does the scripture really have to say about this subject? So why are we surprised by disability? I think one of the best ways to communicate this idea to you is to tell you a little story about Tim. This happened about 2 years ago. My youngest son, Tim, the one who has Down syndrome, as I said, he's in high school now, and Tim loves the Lord, he loves life, and he loves the Disney Channel. So several years ago when High School Musical came out, Tim decided that he wanted to be Troy Bolton. So he went to the athletic director at the high school, and he tried to join the basketball team. So I get a call from the athletic director's office, and Tim was on the phone, and this is the middle of the school day, and I answered the phone, and Tim says, "Mom, I have great news." And I said, "What?" He goes, "I made the team." And so I knew there had to be more to it than this, because Tim's 5'2", 170 pounds, and has never played a day of basketball in his life. So the athletic director got on the phone, and he said, agreed to make Tim the manager of the team. And so I thought, that's great. And I'm sure that's not what Tim's thinking right now. So I figured I'm going to have a little bit of explaining to do. And he gets off the phone, so that was fine. Tim came home on the bus later that afternoon. I met him down at the bus stop, and he was still ecstatic about making the team and that he was going to be on the basketball team. And I said, "Well, Tim, you are part of the team, and that's good news." I said that, but your role in the team you're going to be the manager. And I said, that's going to be a really good fit because Tim has gifts of encouragement. Tim is a real organizer. So those kind of things, this is a good fit for you. And he looks at me and goes, "Is that the same as the captain?" And I said, "Well, not exactly." So once I explained it, or what the manager actually did, then the tears started to come. And Tim started explaining to me, how his conversation had gone in the athletic director's office, and he looked at me and he said, when he said I could be the manager, he said, frankly, I was shocked. Tim was seeing life through the lens of the Disney Channel, right? And because of that, it caused him to see his situation, to see others, and to see himself inaccurately. And and we're not any different than Tim. We each have a lens through which we see life. And it may not be the Disney Channel for us, right? But it's called a worldview. Your worldview is a lens through which you see the world. And at times it causes us to see our situations, ourselves and others inaccurately. And as a result, that's why we're often surprised by disability, even shocked. So let's talk about the three different lenses, the three different worldviews through which people typically tend to think about disability, and then let's sort out what does the scripture have to say about this. What I want to do first, this is the ADA definition of disability, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. I don't usually do a biblical presentation starting with the ADA, but this actually helps because it delineates the terms a little bit. So bear with me for a second here. With respect to an individual, the term disability means A, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of such an individual, B, a record of such an impairment, or C, being regarded as having such an impairment. All right, so the two key things I want you to see in there is that a disability is an impairment. All right, there's a functional aspect to disability in terms of the way the body works or doesn't work. Okay, And then there's a social aspect of disability. That's that part under C there, being regarded as having an impairment. So disability is really recognized as having these two aspects. And you'll find this in general in literature that you'll read on disability as well, that there's a functional aspect to disability, which is the physical or the mental impairment, the part of the body that doesn't work as it was designed to work, and that substantially limits some of life's activities. And that there's a social dimension that, in addition to the impairment, actually ends up disabling people more. So that has to do with the attitudes we have towards people with disability and how that adds additional limitation to a person that has a physical or an intellectual impairment. So the key things to remember there are that impairments disable functionally, but attitudes disable relationally. Okay, impairments disable functionally, but attitudes disable relationally. So if we carry these different ideas about disability around in our heads, what are the source of those ideas? The ideas that I had in my head the evening that I heard that Tim had Down syndrome, what was the source of those different ideas? In general, I think there's really three streams of thought floating around in our culture right now, and we're in a period, where our culture is really shifting in a lot of different ways, and because we're really transforming from one era of history into another one, and so there are a lot of different ideas flying around about a lot of different subjects, but this is true in disability as well. The historical view, or what could be termed the modernist view of disability, which has been the recent centuries of history up to the present, is one of the views on disability, and I'll talk about that. The second one is the postmodern view, which is the emerging view that's coming in Western culture on many different fronts, but also in the area of disability. And then there's the biblical view. And so I wanted to present the modernist view, the postmodern view, and contrast those so that you can see actually what can we affirm out of each, what can we not affirm, and what does the scripture have to say about this. C.S. Lewis once said, "Good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered." And the thing that really propelled me to write the book in the first place was the fact that I felt like I kept running into all this bad philosophy, okay, when I was trying to figure out in my own mind, to understand in my own mind, what did Down syndrome mean in Tim's life? What did it mean in the life of our family? How did I interpret that through the lens of Scripture? And I felt like the culture had all these different conflicting answers, and I really felt compelled to try to sort this out and understand it for myself. So good philosophy must exist if for no reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. Let's talk about the modernist perspective first. The modernist perspective on disability is essentially that disability is an abnormal part of life in a normal world. It's an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world. And of course, it's been resented by people with disabilities throughout the centuries. How would you like to be viewed as an aberration? That's what that essentially says. It says that you're an aberration in the category of human beings. And so in modernist thinking, which really essentially comes out of the thinking of the Enlightenment, which has been, dominant thinking in Western thought for centuries, there are two ideas floating around in that, and that's the idea that human progress is both possible and inevitable, that human culture is moving towards some type of utopia, okay, and that science is the key to that progress. Human progress is both possible and inevitable, and that science is the key to that progress. So if you think about disability, and disability is an abnormal part of life in a normal world, what's the role of science in that? Well, science is really seen as the way to fix, eliminate, or perfect disability when you encounter it. It's to fix, eliminate, or perfect it. So it's really focused in the modernist lens entirely on the idea of the functional impairment, that part of disability, the part of the body that doesn't work as it was intended to. And so this, unfortunately, though, has really become the foundation for many abuses against people with disabilities. If you look at the history of people with disabilities over the centuries, they've been segregated, institutionalized, even until relatively recent times in American history, sterilized and eliminated. And so what I want to just touch on briefly is just the role of eugenics in American culture and how this has helped to bring some of these things about. Eugenics is basically a byproduct of the modernist view. The word eugenics actually means normal genes or good genes. And it really is the whole idea that through effective breeding, the human species can, by selective breeding, and I'm quoting here from Charles Darwin's cousin who named the whole idea of eugenics. His name was Francis Galton, and he coined the word. Getting rid of the undesirables by multiplying the desirables. Getting rid of the undesirables by multiplying the desirables. And the result of that was the institutions that you've either read about or maybe even seen. You may not realize it, but eugenics research really didn't start in Nazi Germany. When we think of eugenics, we often think of Nazi Germany, but it really started here in the United States. So we're still living with the significant byproducts of eugenics today, and this whole mindset of that disability is an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world, and that it needs to be fixed, perfected, or eliminated. The thing is, though, you need to be aware that eugenics is still alive and well today. The reason I have a picture of my little friend Ian Gould up there is that babies with Down syndrome are still systematically eliminated through prenatal testing. And the statistics are very high in terms of the number of children with Down syndrome who are diagnosed as having Downs in utero and then eliminated through abortion. So there are different means that we use today, but the root causes are still the same. The root causes are in this mindset that disability is an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world. As a result of modernist thinking and a lot of the failures of modernism in the 20th century, which included things in the larger culture like several world wars, the development of the atomic bomb, the Holocaust, people started to say, this whole idea that society's on some linear trajectory towards utopia and that science is the answer was something that the culture started to reject. And so postmodern thought started to come about it as a reaction, essentially, to modernism. And Douglas Groothuis, who wrote the book Truth Decay, if you're ever interested in reading a little bit about postmodernism, it's an excellent book. He says, postmodernism is, in many ways, modernism gone to seed, carried to its logical conclusion and inevitable demise. Postmodernism understandably looks at these breakdowns in the 20th century, including ways that people with disabilities were really abused in 20th century life. And so here are two examples on the slide that you can see. That one is called The Black Stork. That was an example of a movie that was developed in 1917 that was really all about the whole idea that babies that had disabilities were delivered by the black stork, right? Remember the whole idea that babies were delivered by the stork? The black stork used to deliver babies who had disabilities, and that was the idea in that film. The other picture up there is from the era of Nazi Germany, and that's in German, but my son, who's a German major, translated it for me, and this is what it says. 60,000 Reichsmarks is what this person suffering from hereditary defects costs the people's community during his lifetime. Fellow German, that is your money too. Right? This is what postmodern disability activists are reacting against, and understandably so. These two things represent significant failures in society in terms of how we look at people with disabilities because of this historical view of disability. So as a result, what ended up happening is we started shifting then from a functional view of disability, right, this modernist functional view that focused entirely on the impairment, to what's called a socially constructed view of disability, which focuses on the social or the relational aspects of disability. And if you asked a postmodern to respond to this historical idea of disability, they'd say, well, no, disability occurs all across different countries and across all socioeconomic groups, and has occurred throughout the centuries. It's not an abnormal part of life, it's a normal part of life. It's a normal part of life in a normal world. In fact, disability is a difference, no different than hair color. And I've heard that expression used before. It's an understandable reaction to the modernist approach. And here's one of the quotes that I heard at a Down syndrome conference a number of years ago. Having a disability is a difference like any other human characteristic. It's by no means a tragedy, does not deserve pity or benevolence or charity. Now's the time to recognize and celebrate disability. Can you hear the shift in the language? It's gone from fixing, eliminating, perfecting to celebrating the disability itself. You'll hear terminology like disability is natural, and the idea that there is no negative import at all with disability other than what we socially attach to it. Okay, now, this understandable reaction to the historical view, but the problem is that it's really not completely honest. Because disability, if you have a disability yourself, or if you have a family member who has a disability, then you know that there is some negative import. There is some difficulty that comes with living with disability, and it's not all just from social construction. So, and here's the other thing too, is that the postmodern idea of disability ends up celebrating the diagnosis, right? Let's celebrate disability instead of the person. I mean, the person's always been celebratory, and shame on us for not recognizing that in the past. But is the disability itself celebratory? And if disability itself was celebratory, why don't we all go out and try to get traumatic brain injuries, right? That's a logical conclusion of that type of thought. The difficult thing for families is that this postmodern perspective really invalidates the grieving process that goes on for families who are affected by disability and are trying to work through some of the real difficulties that occur in life as a result of living with disability in family life. So what's the balance? What's the truth? Shouldn't surprise us that we can find the truth in the scriptures, right? And so let's look at what's true so far about what we have heard from the modernist and postmodern perspective. What can we not affirm, and then what does the scripture specifically have to say? What's true? What can we affirm about what we heard so far? Disability does involve real functional impairment, right? Disability does involve real and often relentless difficulties in life. Adaptations can be made, but disability usually cannot be fixed. Disability does occur across all cultures. It does occur with unpredictable regularity. It is exacerbated by people's biases and negative responses. But what do we have to disagree with? We don't live in a naturalistic world where all that there is what we can see. We live in a God-centered universe, and that there is a grand story of creation, and it's not a linear drive to utopia, right? There's the whole picture of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation that's told across Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. And that the life and the purposeful life that God tells us about in the Scriptures, not the meaningless life that postmodern life really tries to convince us of. This grand story that's in Scripture really addresses, and this is the beauty of it, it addresses both the functional aspects of disability and it addresses the social aspects of disability. It acknowledges the reality of both. If you look at the writings of Francis Schaeffer, who was a well-known apologist in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and wrote quite a number of different books. If you haven't read any, I really encourage you to read them. From his book, The God Who Is There, he makes this statement. If one begins to consider the differences between Christianity and rationalistic philosophy's answers, one must begin by understanding that man and history are now abnormal. In other words, the answer to our question about disability is that disability, from a biblical perspective, is a normal part of life in an abnormal world. It's the world that isn't as it was intended to be originally, right? And as a result, everything is affected by the fall. Not just people with disabilities, but every person in life, in every aspect of their personhood. And when we start to see the world accurately through a biblical worldview lens, we start to see ourselves more accurately and others more accurately as well. Disability is really, like every other form of brokenness and difficulty in life, is a byproduct of the fall. As a result, disability is something that we should expect to happen. Disability has both a functional aspect, an impairment, a part of the body that doesn't work as it was designed to, right? And a subjective aspect or the social aspect that has to do with our sinful hearts and the way that we treat people or don't treat people. Both of those things are very real parts of disability in the biblical picture. So yes, people do have real impairments or real limitations. People have real attitudes and behaviors that oppress people both passively and actively, and as a result disable others further. My background's in economics, and so every once in a while I descend into graphs. It's how I see the world. So, so I think this picture has helped me a lot. If you look at this, if you look at it down the vertical axis, you can see that I put on there different aspects of our personhood, right? The intellectual, the psychological, the emotional, the social, the physical, and the spiritual. And if you look along the horizontal, it goes from 0 to 100%. Right? And if we really understand how the fall affects every area of life for every person in every dimension of our personhood, you realize that because of God's common grace, none of us is at 0 in any of those categories. And yet, none of us is at 100% either because of the effects of the fall and the brokenness of creation. So all of us live somewhere in that realm of gray area between 0 and 100. Right? And so you could probably even think about different capacities that you have or don't have, right? And to look at all the ways in which where you might fall into these different bars on this graph as you even reflect on your own life. And so I think when we start to understand that because of the fall, none of us has 100% capacities in any area of life, we start to see ourselves more accurately, and we see those around us more accurately as well. Let me give you an example from Tim's life. While my son Tim intellectually requires things to be explained to him more concretely, spiritually he's often able to see things much more clearly than I am. This picture up here is a picture of an opportunity international brochure that came in the mail when my kids were in early elementary school. And I was so stunned by the picture of poverty that this presented that I put it out at the dinner table one night, and we passed it around, and we started talking about poverty. And our oldest son, Fred, is on the academically gifted end of the spectrum. So we immediately launched into this discussion on the root causes of poverty, and we were going around and around about these different things. And Timmy was sitting there the whole time, his eyebrows started to furrow, and he just kept looking at this picture. And he finally interrupted us, and he said, do we have money? And everybody stopped talking, and we all looked at him, and he said, couldn't we send some? Tim intellectually may have more limited capacities in some areas than I do, but I can tell you that spiritually, Tim has capacities that far exceed my own. When we see that disability is a normal part of life in an abnormal world, we really start to understand ourselves and others more accurately. This is what I want you to go home thinking about. Disability is simply a more noticeable form of the brokenness and difficulty that's common to the human experience. It's a normal part of life in an abnormal world. Why are those of us who self-identify as normal and healthy, why are we surprised by disability when we encounter it? Because the lens through which we see our world, right, our worldview. If we're thinking from a modernist perspective, we're seeing that disability is an abnormal part of life in an otherwise normal world. And if we're honest, almost all of us carry at least some of that thinking around in our heads. Postmodern view, disability is just a normal part of life in a normal world. And in a sense, that really doesn't elicit any response from me whatsoever, does it? That's also not a biblical perspective. But the biblical view is that it's a more noticeable form of the brokenness that's common to the human experience. If you look at Jesus' encounter with the man born blind in John chapter 9, do you remember that story? Jesus and his disciples were walking along the road, and they came along a man who was born blind. And the disciples immediately launched into a little conversation, not unlike the one we had around our dinner table, right? And they were exploring all the reasons why this man had a disability. And they turned to Jesus and they said, so was this man born blind because of his sin or the sin of his parents? And I love how Jesus takes their question and he turns it on his head, and he said, this happened that the work of God might be displayed in his life. God's in the business of taking whatever is broken and difficult in any of our lives and redeeming it for his glory. So Jesus settled the question, and we can be thankful for that. And let's take an opportunity then to try to think, how do I see myself more accurately? How do I see my neighbor more accurately? By seeing them through the eyes of Christ.
Steph closes Chapter 1 of the book with these words: "Upholding a biblical perspective of disability really matters, because when we see our world truthfully, we can view ourselves more correctly. When we view ourselves more correctly, we can also regard others more accurately. When we regard others more accurately, we are more likely to respond to them appropriately. As the South African proverb states, truth and the morning become light with time. Well, it's time." Please take a few moments to listen to the following interviews and consider the questions posed at the end of each segment.
Yeah, growing up with a disability, I'm trying to remember when I first realized that I had a disability. I mean, I think I knew I couldn't walk, but then my friend Larry across the street was a horrible baseball player. And, as a 6-year-old, I don't think I differentiated between the two. Where you really notice the difference in disability are the milestones. I remember when I was in first grade. The big deal with first grade is you go to school all day. On kindergarten, where I grew up, it's either morning or afternoon. You did half day. First grade, you go to school the full day. So first day of grade school, my mom drops me off for first grade. I can tell which desk is mine because it's the tallest one. So I rolled up behind it, got my little crayons and paste and all the stuff that comes with first grade. And then lunchtime came, and my mom took me home. We had lunch. After lunch, she sits me down in front of the TV, which, of course, this is way back when we still do that today. Anyway, she put me down in front of the TV. And I thought, but I'm in first grade. So Mom, why am I not going back to school? And she said, well, the school system, or the superintendent, who was the elder of the church, said that, maybe the best thing to do is to try it for a half day. And if that goes well, you will start letting you go a full day. And of course, as a first grader, I'm doing the math, that if I go to school half a day, I'll be like 5 million years old when I graduate from high school. And I said, doesn't it make more sense to let me try it for a full day? If that doesn't work, cut back to a half a day. And I don't remember anything my mother said, except that next I was back in the car. She was dropping me off at school, telling the teacher, basically, he's yours. I'll see him at lunchtime.
How do you think the worldview of Jerry's elder might have affected his ideas about Jerry's schooling?
One of the just really ironic parts of dealing with the world of disability, both personally as a person with disability and professionally, is the where do you balance the fact that the wheelchair is real and I have a doctor's appointment on Thursday, and that appointment is because of my disability, versus those who say that disability is no different than hair color. I know people who change their hair color at will. It is totally different than I'm still going to be in the wheelchair tomorrow. There are practical, real medical implications to my disability. Yes, we should be able to look past the disability and see the person more often than we do. And I think that's what those people who are saying that disability is no different than eye color, that's the goal, and that should be the goal. That really ought to be the goal, but we're not going to do it 100% well, 100% of the time, and I would be ecstatic if we did it 50% well, 50% of the time.
Why do we often find it so much easier to see the disability than to see the person?
I guess the eye-opener is that we have found people who love him exactly like he is. And I don't feel like I need to water him down in order for people here to love him. So that has changed everything.
How does seeing ourselves through the lens of the gospel change how we treat others? How does love change everything?